Very good afternoon. The morning session has actually set the stage for us, but there's also the complication of after lunch, being the first speaker. I'm Ananda. I'm part of SABIC's Global Corporate Sustainability team, and I lead the global LCA competency. And although the session is on decarbonization, I took the freedom to expand decarbonization and see its synergies with circularity, because there's a lot to be gained when they are actually seen together. So the first slide is actually, I think this slide is already helped by the morning session with a lot of the context setting that has already happened. We have the context of the consumer and NGO pressure, the whole confluence about climate change and the 1.5 degree pursuit, but you're also having in this industry the context of plastics and both the perception and the factual issues around it. And the brand owner exposure, the ones who are further downstream and facing the consumer also have further contextual elements around some of this. And there are technological gaps. Some of them were also briefly highlighted in the earlier sessions. A lot is to be done in the first decade and the next decades to come to reach the 1.5. And the regulatory environment has been playing a great role here, also in setting the stage. And some of these, for instance, the European Green Deal and the extensions of it. There was mention in the morning about the border taxation. Although we may be a producer, let's say in India, but if you're supplying into Europe, there are certain other standards we may have to set for the industry. So this actually goes on to further extensions of scope 1, 2, and 3, but even boils down to calculating the carbon footprint of each of the products that we service going into Europe or any other part of the world. And what could this mean in terms of sustainability, and what are the various flavors and recipe that it should have, right? For instance, you have the safer chemistry elements, you have sustainable products, and then there's also the context of circular chemistry. I would probably keep the first one, and the third have also a lot of synergic elements together. On one side, while we are looking at how can products have safe chemistry and green chemistry incorporated, they also have to go hand in hand with circularity and aspect, in terms of how it is holistically looked at in context of design for recyclability, but at the same time you're looking into green chemistry aspects and vice versa. And the same also applies for carbon efficiency and circularity, because we are also almost interchangeably using the principles of carbon here, and there are also elements of carbon from a recycling point of view. When you look at carbon capture and utilization, it also starts bordering into circularity, right? So in many aspects of decarbonization for chemical industry, you would actually see that there is quite a lot of synergic elements that decarbonization can have with circularity. This is SABIC's top sustainability priorities. It's sort of the materiality elements which has sort of taken us here. And then what are those important ingredients in terms of resource efficiency? There's quite a lot talked about it already in the morning, and the middle part, which is around the confluence element that I've kept as a theme for this talk, around climate change and circularity, and what are those synergistic elements. Innovation plays a crucial role here, and also in terms of the environment, health and safety, as well as governance, right? And there's quite a lot of the small logos which represents the SDG goals, and there are 10 of them that have been identified from the fuller list. Not to overlook the ones that are not on this page, but in context of setting the priorities. And they have then actually, it has culminated in these 4 sustainability pillars, which actually includes climate change and circularity as one of those important elements, but also safer chemistry as another key ingredient. But at the end of the day, it's also about setting up the stage for transparency, being able to demonstrate action, and how do you do the narrative around it, right? So that's the ESG disclosures part. This is probably the only introductory slide that I have in my deck, which is introducing the topic of scope 1, 2, and 3. And of course, we know that the 1 and 2, which is more immediate to our operations in terms of those that are operated within our fences and with the heat and power that we use also within our fences. But the scope 3 has also been expressed enough in the previous sessions about the complexity of it, because you have 15 of those categories, and how do you consistently measure and report on some of these complex categories. But the context setting for this page and the confluence I was talking about is around the scope 3 element. Like for instance, the choices you can actually make in circularity can also have solutions around scope 3, because there are questions around how scope 3 is being tackled. There are possible areas where the right choices of feedstocks and end-of-life solutions can give you important mileage on scope 3. And that's ties back to the confluence part I was talking about earlier. And this is SABIC's carbon neutrality page. So it talks about SABIC's commitment recently, which talking about the carbon neutrality for 2050. But 2050 is still roughly 3 decades away. What are we doing about the immediate targets? Like SABIC's interim targets for 2030 are expressed on this page, and the emphasis about scope 3, where like the industry itself is in varied levels of understanding and like the measurements around scope 3, right? So the crucial part is getting the measurement part consistent across the industry and across regions, and then being able to set actionable targets where it's the scope 3 is the special case where it's not a solution that's solved alone. It's more of a value chain effect where you have to solve it necessarily with your value chain partners playing along with you here. And the upper part of the page is more about the target or the vision around carbon neutrality. The lower part of the page expresses things that we are actually doing on ground. Like so the elements when you lay this out on our roadmap chart for how carbon neutrality can actually be visualized, there are the obvious ones like renewable energy, which like almost everyone across the globe is trying to adopt, as long as the scope 2 emphasis is there. But besides the what we could call almost entitlements in terms of energy efficiency and renewable energy, which almost like it's been expressed as entitlements to have. But the more complex ones are things like electrification. Like the traditional process industry, the chemical industry, has been primarily running on thermal energy as with fossil fuels as the primary basis of transmitting energy into the processing. So this like could take a step change in terms of being electrified. Much easier said than done, because it involves a lot of effort to convert an energy that has been transmitted through thermal sources to electricity. But a lot of effort is going in this direction with SABIC, but also more collaboratively with other industry peers. Carbon capture is another crucial part, where of course I had mentioned earlier that SABIC has start in carbon capture much before a lot of the decarbonization momentum has stepped in. We have had some of the CO2 capture plants in Saudi Arabia which had been doing part of this in quite some time earlier. And of course the whole principle of green and blue, although there are standards that are like still evolving in terms of what is the right green and blue attributes you should express. But it's clear that like these green and blue elements in their own definitions are necessarily an important component of the recipe. And this page also shows little more of the visual details in terms of what SABIC is doing in this direction, starting from the top left, which actually talks about the renewable energy adoption. There's also the top right, which talks about renewable energy, but more specific one, we have one of our polycarbonate plants in Europe, specifically in Spain, converting to fully renewable energy. It's renewable electricity, to be more correct. And of course, the electrification part, which I alluded to on the earlier slide, is about how do you switch thermal to like primarily run on electric. And it's been approached as a consortium because taking a cue from some of the earlier remarks that Mr. Kapoor made, there are those non-confidential parts like where the best practices and even innovation can be actually collaborative. And there's the one which I mentioned earlier on the previous slides about the world's largest CO2 purification and capture plant. SABIC has this plant in Saudi Arabia, which has design capacity for about 500,000 tons of CO2 capture. And the possible avenues for CO2 capture could range from using it in methanol processes to those that you can use for urea production and so on. And this slide sets the context for the shift from what I was describing previously for like core decarbonization to an extension of decarbonization, but from a circularity point of view, right? So this is, SABIC calls this the true circle. It's kind of a portfolio of solutions that are catering to circularity, starting from the traditional, like solutions that depend on mechanical recycling, but also those that depend on, feedstock switches from, certified circular, which is a little more advanced in terms of, pyrolysis route to fixing waste plastics that are difficult to process in mechanical recycle, but making new plastics out of it. The renewable part, which mostly is on bio-based feedstocks, and the design element, which I was talking about earlier. It's not only about the other aspects, but the design for recyclability is also a collaborative element. So is this closed loop initiative, because these are the ones in the bottom of the screen are one of those important parts of the scope 3, besides the other ones which can also solve scope 3. But the ones on the lower part of the page are more important from collaborative partnerships. And this page picks up one of the previous elements from the previous page, which is talking about the advanced chemical recycling. And this room with the audience would not need the technical introductions of this topic, but it's about how the plastics that are difficult to recycle in a traditional setting can actually find their way back through pyrolysis and certain pre-processing, that they are compatible for feeding into the cracker. So basically they would avoid the need for a traditional feedstock going into the cracker. And then the whole mechanism of, what does it mean from a decarbonization point of view and circularity point of view at the same time. And this page actually gives us a little more of the context setting in terms of, how do you see some of these elements shaping up together, where a lot of the ones that I have on the page, you might identify either with decarbonization or with circularity separately, but if you want to see them on the same page, it also makes all the more sense, right? So there's, you can start any part of the page, but if you start with the far right, which is the fossil carbon footprint, that's the traditional, the height of the bar represents the carbon footprint from cradle to gate. And then if you look at the middle ones, which are in yellow, it's all around the varying ranges of, like mechanical recycling, where if you're able to make a mechanically recycled part with 100% PCR content, it can be very attractive. But at the same time, if you want to look at it from a practicality point of view, 100% PCR might not satisfy the performance requirements for many applications. So you have to be realistic about it. And then when you start looking at more realistic options, ranging from those that have only 30% recycled PCR content to more ambitious ones, the carbon footprint is somewhere in the range, but it of course is going to be lower than the virgin, right? But there are also the blue and the green ones, which are also solutions on their own stand in terms of bio-based feedstocks, which can give you important advantages in terms of decarbonization, as well as chemical recycling, depending on, like which part of the world, and what it also, like avoids, can, like potentially be looked at as a decarbonization from a system point of view. And I finish off with this page, which is actually looking at a little more of a chronology part of SABIC solutions from circularity point of view. But as I said, as I said before, this is the confluence part. Like many of the solutions that you have on this page, you could identify with decarbonization as much as you could identify with circularity. And what is also important to see is, the emphasis that we have seen having probably from the last 3 years, because the chronology, the number of the years that are mentioned on the page has much more from 2019 onwards, which also tells how fast the industry is adapting to some of these trends. And I'm happy to share these details and happy to answer any questions with you. Thank you so much.